Okay, let's dive straight in today. We're tackling something, well, pretty huge and really complex: addiction.
Absolutely. It's fundamental to understanding behavior, and
Yeah.
it touches so many lives. Psychologically, it's just fascinating.
It really is. It makes you look at everything, doesn't it? From like brain chemistry down to just habits people learn.
And social stuff, individual differences,
Yeah,
it's all in there.
exactly. And for this deep dive, we've got a whole bunch of sources, articles, research bits kind of pulled together for anyone digging into this, especially, you psych students listening.
Yeah, we're looking at the biology, the learning side,
Hmm.
the evidence, what holds up, what maybe doesn't quite capture the full picture.
Right. Our mission basically is to unpack what addiction is, look at these different psychological theories explaining why it happens, and, weigh them up, strengths, weaknesses, the whole deal.
We'll get into dopamine, how habits get wired in, and
Yeah.
even those classic experiments with rats and brain electrodes.
Hmm.
Some pretty wild stuff.
Definitely some surprising details in there. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How do the sources define addiction at its core?
Well, fundamentally, they frame it around dependence. Addiction is seen as this um, psychological or physiological dependence on something, substance, or even an activity.
Right, that distinction is key. Physical versus psychological dependence. What's the main difference there?
So physical dependence is when your body itself has adapted. It literally needs the substance just to function normally.
Hmm.
Think coffee. If you drink it every day, then stop. That headache, feeling wiped out,
Yeah.
that's withdrawal. Your body is physically dependent.
Okay, so the body needs it to avoid feeling bad. What about psychological dependence then?
That's more the mental, the emotional side. It's that feeling you have to have it to cope or relax or just feel okay emotionally, even if there isn't a strong physical craving right then.
Like needing a cigarette when you're stressed, almost automatically.
Exactly. It's tied to emotions or situations, maybe more than that physical gnawing need at that moment.
Got it. Body versus mind reliance. And the sources really flag two big features that go with dependence: tolerance and withdrawal. We touched on withdrawal, but what about tolerance?
Yeah, tolerance is um, needing more and more of the substance or activity to get the same effect you used to.
Your body just gets used to it.
Pretty much. That first coffee gave you a real kick. Now maybe you need two or three just to feel, awake. Your sensitivity drops.
Makes sense. And withdrawal, like we said, is the flip side, those nasty physical or psychological symptoms when you cut back or stop.
Headaches, nausea, muscle pain,
Mm,
or anxiety, irritability, can't sleep, the whole range.
not pleasant.
Definitely not. And here's a crucial link, for why addiction sticks around. Taking the substance again makes those withdrawal symptoms go away almost instantly.
Ah, that relief must be incredibly powerful.
It is, and that relief, that's negative reinforcement. It teaches the brain really strongly, do that again, and the bad feeling stops.
So it's not just chasing a high, it's running from feeling awful.
A huge part of it, yeah. That reinforcement really locks the cycle in place.
Okay, so dependence, tolerance, withdrawal, and that negative reinforcement loop. That sets the scene. Now, let's get into the why. Starting with the biological side, what's happening inside the brain.
Right, this perspective zooms right in on neurochemistry. Sticking with smoking as an example. People know it's bad, but quitting is incredibly tough. And a big reason is how nicotine hijacks the brain's reward system.
And the main player here, according to the sources, is dopamine.
Dopamine, yeah, often called the feel-good chemical, but it's really more about motivation, reward, making things seem important or salient. Nicotine gives a big boost to dopamine release,
Where in the brain does this happen?
especially in areas like the nucleus accumbens. That's a core part of this reward pathway.
So nicotine triggers dopamine, you feel that pleasure or reward. Then what?
Well, dopamine gets cleared away pretty quickly. Reuptake happens, the feeling fades. But the brain remembers it.
Then wants it back.
Exactly. That creates a strong motivation, a craving, to use again to get that dopamine surge back. It's a potent loop.
And the sources say this isn't just a one-off effect, right? Regular use actually changes the brain.
Yeah, that's the really insidious part. Over time, with regular nicotine use, the brain starts to make less of its own dopamine naturally. And the receptors for dopamine become less sensitive.
Whoa, so the brain adapts.
It adapts by becoming reliant on that external nicotine supply just to keep dopamine at a sort of normal level. Without it, the whole reward system is kind of dampened down.
So someone who's heavily dependent isn't just using for pleasure anymore. They need it just to feel baseline.
That's often the case, yeah.
Yeah.
It shifts from seeking pleasure to just avoiding feeling low or off. And when they do stop and cut back,
Withdrawal kicks in hard.
exactly,
Okay.
those already low dopamine levels drop even further. The brain signals distress, and that triggers all those withdrawal symptoms.
Mm.
The irritability, anxiety, focus problems, the physical stuff, it's a direct biological reaction.
You can really see the physical grip there. And there's some classic research backing this up, right? Something involving rats.
Oh yeah, the sources point to Olds and Milner's study from way back in 1954. It was pretty groundbreaking for showing how powerful these reward pathways are.
The one with the electrodes. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so they put tiny electrodes into a part of the rat's brains, the hypothalamus, which we now know is linked to these dopamine reward circuits. And they set it up so the rats could press a lever to get little electrical stimulation in that area.
They could basically reward themselves directly.
Exactly. And the results were, well, kind of shocking. The rats would just press that lever again and again and again, thousands of times. They'd choose it over food, water, basic survival stuff.
Wow.
And the sources mention this bit. They'd even run across an electrified floor, taking painful shocks, just to get to the lever to press it again.
Crossing a pain grid for brain stimulation, that really shows the power of that reward pathway.
It really does. The conclusion was pretty clear. Activating those dopamine pathways is an incredibly strong reinforcer, maybe even stronger than avoiding pain. It gave strong early support for a biological drive behind reward seeking, which is key to addiction.
Okay, so that biological view gives a compelling picture of the brain's role, the physical side. But, thinking critically like psych students need to, what are the strengths of just looking at the brain?
Well, like we just saw with Olds and Milner, and newer stuff like neuroimaging studies, Zahn et al.
Yeah.
is mentioned there's solid empirical evidence. You can see changes in brain activity, dopamine levels.
And these studies are often tightly controlled.
Usually, yeah. Lab settings let you isolate variables, try to show cause and effect, like nicotine causes dopamine release. That's good for scientific rigor.
And it explains relapse pretty clearly, too, doesn't it?
Yes. The biological explanation for relapse is straightforward. During withdrawal, that dopamine deficit creates a powerful biological urge to use, again, just to feel normal, to fix that imbalance. It nails the physical craving aspect.
Okay, strong evidence, controlled studies, explains physical relapse, solid points. But what about the downsides? Does focusing only on neurochemistry miss the bigger picture?
That's the main critique the sources raise. It risks being reductionist,
Meaning
meaning it reduces this really complex human behavior addiction down to just chemicals and brain circuits. It kind of ignores everything else.
like the person's thoughts, feelings, their whole life situation.
Exactly. Psychological factors, coping skills, self-esteem, trauma, and social factors. Poverty, stress, peer pressure, family. Those get sidelined in a purely neurochemical view. It's very internal.
What about genes? Don't some people seem more prone to addiction?
Yeah, the sources mention that too. Research, like Dweiko's work cited, suggests genetics play a role, creating a predisposition. The basic neurochemical model doesn't always fully account for that inherited vulnerability.
And the rat study. How well does that apply to humans in the real world?
That's the generalizability question. Animal studies are vital, but you have to be careful extrapolating directly to complex human addiction with all its social and psychological layers. It's a limitation.
So great for the physical nuts and bolts, maybe not the whole story? Okay, let's switch gears dramatically. What about the learning theory explanation? This moves us out of the brain and into the environment, right?
Exactly. This perspective says addictive behavior isn't just biology gone wrong, it's learned. Learned through interactions with the world around us like any other habit.
And social learning theory is a big part of this.
A very big part. Bandura's idea. We learn by watching others, imitating them, especially if we see them get rewarded. Think about teenagers starting to smoke.
Seeing parents smoke, or friends, or even celebrities.
Precisely. You see the behavior, maybe you associate it with being cool or fitting in. That's the observed reward, so you try it. The sources cite studies like Akers and Lee showing strong links between teen smoking and what their peers and parents do. And Mulchan et al. Found something like 75% of teen smokers had a parent who smoked. That's real-world human data supporting this modeling idea.
Wow, that's a high percentage. Okay, so observation is one way. What about operant conditioning? How does that fit in?
Operant conditioning is all about how consequences shape our actions. Addictive behaviors stick because they have powerful consequences. They get reinforced.
Both positively and negatively.
Absolutely. Positive reinforcement. Smoking brings pleasure, maybe social acceptance, a feeling of relaxation, negative reinforcement, which we touched on. Smoking takes away something unpleasant, stress, boredom, those horrible withdrawal symptoms.
And that relief, taking away the bad stuff, is super powerful.
Hugely reinforcing, maybe even more than the pleasure aspect over time. And then there's classical conditioning. This leads to cue reactivity.
Yeah, like Pavlov's dogs, associating things together.
Exactly. All the things that regularly happen around smoking, the smell of smoke, seeing a lighter, being in a pub, having a drink, finishing a meal, these become cues. They get strongly linked in the brain with the effects of nicotine or the relief it brings.
So just seeing those cues, even without feeling withdrawal, can trigger a craving?
Yes, powerfully so.
Yeah.
Just seeing a pack of cigarettes or walking past a usual smoking spot can unleash intense cravings, even physical responses. The brain has learned that association.
Like a learned reflex, almost.
Kind of. The sources mention an fMRI study, Engelman et al., showing smokers' brains lighting up in reward areas just when they saw pictures related to smoking. This cue reactivity is a huge factor in relapse, long after physical dependence might be gone.
That makes sense. The habit gets tangled up with your environment.
Okay.
Let's evaluate this theory. Strengths of the learning perspective.
Well, a big strength is it brings in the environment and the psychological side. It looks beyond just biology to how social context and individual learning shape behavior.
And it's backed by human studies more often.
Yes. Research on modeling, peer pressure, cue reactivity that's mostly done with people, in real-world contexts or labs simulating them. So it has good ecological validity. It reflects reality better, perhaps.
And cue reactivity is a really strong point for explaining relapse, especially later on.
Definitely. It explains why someone could be clean for months, feel fine, then suddenly get hit with massive cravings after encountering an old trigger. The learned association is still there.
Adds crucial context. What about weaknesses? Does it miss anything?
Well, just like the biological view could be reductionist, the learning view can be too, just in the other direction. By focusing so much on learning and environment, it can downplay biology.
Ignoring genes or brain changes?
Potentially, yeah. It doesn't always fully integrate those physiological aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it can be a bit nomothetic.
Meaning it assumes everyone learns the same way.
Kind of. It focuses on general laws of learning. But why does one person exposed to smoking peers start and another doesn't? It struggles sometimes with those individual differences in susceptibility.
And the free will question comes up again.
It does. If behavior is just learned responses to environmental stimuli and consequences, where's personal choice? Strict behaviorism can seem deterministic, suggesting our environment dictates our actions.
Okay, so two powerful perspectives, biological and learning, each with strengths and weaknesses, maybe each a bit incomplete on its own. How does psychology today try to reconcile this?
The sources really lean towards an interactionist perspective, sometimes called the biopsychosocial model. It basically says addiction isn't usually about one thing, it's a complex interplay.
Not nature or nurture, but nature and nurture working together.
That's the core idea. Nature might give you a genetic predisposition, maybe your brain reacts more strongly to dopamine, or you get physically dependent faster. Nurture is the environment where you encounter the substance, learn the associations, face stressors, get reinforcement, pick up those cues.
So addiction arises from how someone's biology interacts with their life experiences and environment.
Exactly. You need to consider the whole picture. The biological vulnerability, how substance use then physically changes the brain, and how learned habits and environmental triggers keep the cycle going. It's the interaction that's key.
That feels much more complete, much more realistic for something this complex.
It definitely seems to capture the reality better than either perspective alone.
Right. So we've covered a lot today in this deep dive, especially for you listening who are studying psychology. We started with defining addiction, that dependence idea, physical versus psychological, tolerance, withdrawal.
Yeah, and how powerful avoiding withdrawal is, that negative reinforcement. Then we went deep into the brain, the biological view, nicotine messing with dopamine, changing brain chemistry, Olds and Milner's rat.
And we looked at its strength, the physical evidence, but also its weakness being maybe too reductionist.
Then we flipped to learning theory, how addictions learned watching others, getting rewarded, or avoiding punishment through operant conditioning, and those environmental cues becoming triggers via classical conditioning.
Backed by human studies, explaining relapse triggers well, but again, potentially reductionist in its own way, maybe downplaying biology or individual choice.
And finally, we saw how the interactionist view tries to bring it all together. Nature and nurture, biology and learning.
For you as psych students, this whole discussion really shows how different theories try to explain something complex and why it's so important to evaluate them critically. Look at the evidence, see the strengths, see the limits.
And how combining insights from different perspectives, like biology and learning, often gives you a richer, more complete understanding. No single theory has all the answers here.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. If addiction really is this incredibly tangled mix of brain chemistry, genetics, and deeply learned habits tied to specific environments, what does that sheer complexity tell us about why recovery can be so challenging?
Right. And thinking practically, how do treatments, whether therapy, medication, support groups, how do they need to be designed to effectively tackle both the biological side and that unique learning history and environmental context for each person?
Something to really think about as you continue your own deep dive into psychology.